Chapter 1. I opened my amber eyes on my first day of existence to the inside of a strange flower. It had large orange petals that met at the top, where a honeycomb-like substance was growing down. I found myself kneeling on a spongy yellow disc where, in front of me, there sat 2 gold coins. I blinked at them slowly, tilting my head to the side as I inspected them, when suddenly I heard a silky smooth voice. I looked around the flower, confused as to where the voice had come from, only to find the foggy image of a woman materializing in front of me. "Hello there. We don't have much time, so allow me to cut right to the chase. Your name is Autumn, and my name is Theia. I am the sun goddess, and I exist inside of you." The image spoke quickly and with confidence, so I nodded, taking this as fact. "My name is Autumn. I like this name. But why am I named after a season?" I asked. "That's not important. There are plenty of other, more important things to cover." She dismissed my question, and I furrowed my brow at her, a silent protest that she ignored. "Now, the first thing you should know is that this is what you look like." She motioned to herself, a pale-skinned woman with long brown braids, gold patterns etched into her skin, and wings of golden flame. I looked down at myself, and sure enough, this was true. "Second, you have no memories of your past life, and you will never have negative feelings in this one. This is to protect you from something horrible you did in your last life," she explained. "People don't normally remember their past lives," I said, from a knowledge instilled in my soul, confused. "Well, you have been reincarnated as a race that does. You are what is known as an Ellylldan, a fire fairy. People that are reincarnated as Ellylldan are those that in a past life were wronged, committed a heinous act in response, and then killed themselves in regret. Your current existence is punishment for that," Theia responded. I gave her a look of further confusion. "That seems oddly specific." I scrunched my brow skeptically. "Yes, that's true, but it happens a lot more often than you'd think," she admitted, but then shook her head. "We're getting off track. Anyway, as I was saying, you don't remember things from your past life for a good reason. So while you may ask me anything about your past life, I recommend not asking about anything negative that may have happened. I will, of course, warn you if you're unknowingly asking about something that has to do with those memories." Theia paused to get my confirmation, so I nodded in response. "Good. Now, you are welcome to do whatever you want, but you should also know that I will be using your body whenever I see fit," she continued. "Using it? What does that mean?" I asked. "I will have control over your body. You will have memory of any time I do, though, of course," she explained, and I nodded, a little confused still, but accepting. "Very good. Well, I look forward to working with you, Autumn." The image of the woman smiled and dissolved into the air. I stared at the space left behind for a few more seconds until my eyes once again landed upon the 2 golden coins sitting in the middle of the floor. They lay haphazardly, as though they had been rolled like dice, and I scooted closer to them to take one into my hands. The coin, roughly the length of my pinky, was pure gold and gently engraved with the face of Emperor Usra, the ruler of Athos. His head held high as he stared off into the distance at what I imagined was a grand future. His portrait was surrounded by a gentle filigree that, despite the coin's small size, swirled with perfect curls into a wreath which met at the bottom behind the Emperor's seal. I ran my fingers over the shiny details and pondered how I could know a face that I had no memory of. My head began to buzz with light pain at the thought as I narrowed my eyes at the regal figure on the coin. My ponderings were sharply interrupted, though, as a voice called out to me from outside. "Excuse me, you in there? Could you come out, please?" A woman's voice asked of me, and though the voice had a hint of sadness, I couldn't help but find myself smiling at the quaint, timid nature of it. Curious to know the owner of the voice, I stood, tossing the coins into the pocket of the simple brown dress I was wearing. But as I walked around the entirety of the inside of the flower, I realized that there didn't appear to be a way out of it. I paced around a bit, lost in my confusion, and then leaned against one of the petals in a huff. To my surprise, though, the entire petal suddenly began to move, and before I knew it, I was on my back on the now outstretched petal. I blinked slowly, unmoving at first, before losing myself to a little fit of giggles. Still smiling, I was about to sit up when a woman, a foot taller than me, with golden eyes and a long, puffy black ponytail, leaned over me. Her face was a mix of confusion and slight disgust. "Hi there, were you the one that was calling to me?" I asked, raising an eyebrow at her as I lay on my back still. "Yes? Do you need help up?" She cleared her throat and moved around to my side to offer me her hand. I smiled and accepted it. Once standing, I intended to thank her, but I quickly lost sight of this as my attention was instead brought to the world around me. For the first time, I realized how small I was, as grass, my flower, and even little bugs towered above me. I didn't remember ever being any other size, but somehow this felt out of place and strange. "Oh, right, we're about 2 inches tall, by the way, though we can grow and shrink as we please," the woman explained, as I turned in a little circle, trying to take it all in. "Since you don't know that, I'm guessing you weren't a fairy or anything in your past life?" she asked, flinching a little at her own question, as though she was worried about offending me. "I don't know, but I'm assuming not," I responded shortly, my attention caught by a beetle that skittered across the dirt in front of us, as big as a horse. "What? What do you mean you don't know?" She seemed very taken aback by this, and Theia's words echoed through my mind, reminding me that Ellylldan usually do remember their past lives. "I don't remember anything about my past life," I explained nonchalantly. "I do know my name, though. I'm Autumn." I introduced myself and held out a hand towards her. She looked completely lost by this point, but shook my hand gently nonetheless. "Right. Okay, then. I'm Giovanniel, but people call me Joe." Joe eyed me suspiciously as she spoke, and it was clear that she either didn't believe me or thought I was crazy. I smiled back regardless, though, trying to make it clear that I was intending to be friendly. "Okay, fine. Let's play pretend and say that you don't remember your past life. How come you're not a babbling mess on the floor with no memories?" Joe folded her arms and questioned me. I tilted my head to the side in thought and furrowed my brow. "I'm not sure. I know random things, like the types of magic. Oh, and I also know a few stories, so at least I have good information." Joe narrowed her eyes at me for a moment, and then, taking a step back, rubbed the bridge of her nose. "I get put on blossom duty for the first time in decades, and she's insane. Great." She rolled her eyes. Sorry to interrupt, but what's blossom duty?" I asked, using my fingers to put air quotes around the phrase. Seemingly lost in her foul mood, she took a long moment to rub a hand over her mouth before looking down through squinted eyes. My eyes darted from her to my surroundings as I waited impatiently for her to speak, and almost repeated the question when she finally sighed heavily. "Every time a new Ellylldan is created, one random person living here in the city is chosen to give them the grand tour. We call it blossom duty since the flower comes out of the ground on the day we're created," she explained with a tone that made it seem like she grew more exhausted with every word. I nodded, understanding, and ignoring her sour mood, decided to question my guide. "So, what is this place?" I leaned towards her a bit to get her attention as I asked. She grimaced and sighed once more. "This is Huna Arda, city of the Ellylldan, the cursed, forsaken, and wretched." Joe paused for a moment to look into my eyes before turning her tone towards a more business-like formality. "We exist as penance for our past deeds, and in this existence we have only one purpose, to kill. I know that may be hard for you to hear, but you only have to kill someone once every 3 months. I glanced around in disbelief. "We kill people? Why?" "It just comes with our nature. Our punishment in this life is to kill those that have committed the same wrongdoings as were done to us in our past lives that caused us to commit the heinous acts that got us here," Joe explained, swallowing hard, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. I didn't quite understand, though, so I simply stared at her blankly, waiting for her to continue. Eventually, Joe caught on and sighed. "See an all over there?" She motioned to an Ellylldan with bright red hair and gray skin. She's pretty famous around here because she was queen of an old country a couple millennia ago. Basically, her husband abused her pretty severely, so she killed him and then herself. As an Ellylldan, she now has to kill those that have abused their spouse. All of this seems overly specific. Why would an existence be so clearly defined? I asked doubtingly. Joe simply shrugged. The gods work in mysterious ways, I guess. Crazy bastards. I chuckled at her depressing disposition and threw an arm around her waist in a half hug, since I couldn't quite reach her shoulders. Well, at least we're all in this mess together, I suppose. Don't need to understand everything when you have friends to guide you through the dark, right? Wow, you are just relentlessly optimistic, she said, disgust lining her words. Also, I just met you. We aren't friends. Joe placed a finger on my forehead and pushed me back gently, yet with enough force to make me step back a few paces. I smiled at this, playfully swatting her hand away, and Joe looked at me horrified. So, I tell you that you're going to have to kill people, and yet you're all unicorns and rainbows? What is wrong with you? Joe took a step back from me as she asked. I gave a half smile. I'm sorry if I'm too much. I just don't feel negative emotions, so I have nothing to be upset about. You what? Did your soul get messed up in the underworld or something? How is it that you're like this? She demanded, crossing her arms across her brown dress and beginning to pace nervously. It was at this moment that I realized that we all wore brown, and that although styles were different, the only color for clothes here was brown. I glanced around as I realized this, taking in the different clothing styles, when Joe cleared her throat and brought my attention back to her. Great, crazy and no attention span, she grumbled, and rubbed the bridge of her nose once more in frustration. Feeling an awkward lull drift into the conversation, I tried to change the topic. So, how do we know who to kill? I asked. Joe glared down at me in annoyance, but answered my question anyway. You'll know it when it happens. Sometimes, something just kind of takes over you, and you see this light. I don't know how to explain it, but you'll see it soon enough, Joe said dismissively, and motioned for me to follow her. I did as I was instructed, and we walked together down the city pathways, past rows and rows of orange flowers identical to mine. As we walked, another question occurred to me, so I quickly got Joe's attention. What happens if you don't kill someone within 3 months? Joe winced at the thought. Then the day after the 3-month deadline, you kill the first person you see, other than another Ellylldan, of course. She stopped walking for a moment and turned to face me. So here's a few quick things you should know. We don't get tired, we don't sleep, we can and likely will die. When we die, we reappear in our flowers, and to fly, you just think that you want to do it. She listed off, ready to be rid of me. Wait, that was a lot. Let's go back to the flying thing, I guess? How do I do that? I asked timidly, knowing she was quite annoyed with my presence by this point. Joe hesitated, guilt creeping into her expression, and sighed once more. I'm sorry. I shouldn't just throw you in the deep end like that, she apologized, and waited for my response. I didn't know what to say, though, so I just smiled and hoped that would be enough. Joe smiled awkwardly in return and got back onto the topic at hand. Anyway, so to fly, it's a matter of will. You just will your body in the direction you want to go, and it listens. Here, let me show you. She then demonstrated by effortlessly floating upwards into the air. Other than the slight movement of her wings of flame, flying seemed more an act of pure magic than the wings themselves. With how easy she made it look, I immediately tried it for myself, and to my surprise, it was even easier. Just a slight thought about how I wanted to move was all it took to lift me high into the air, and I found that I had complete control over how I flew. Once in the air, I looked out over the city of orange flowers, where half of the flowers, including mine, sat in a large field. The other half rested just above the lake water and mingled with the grass and lilies of a swamp. It was a bright, sunny day, but even with this and all the little lights from the various Ellylldan that flew above the city, the light didn't quite penetrate this place. The air was thick and gloomy, seeming to reflect the moods of those that lived here, and a thick fog wound its way around the outskirts of the city, making it almost impossible to see what lay beyond it. I scrunched my face at this, curious how a place with such potential for beauty could be so lost in the gloom of the swamp. Jo waited for a few moments for me to return to the ground, but when I didn't, she simply flew up to talk to me in the air. This doesn't take much mana, by the way, so we can fly indefinitely. Plus, we don't get tired or sleep, so you can literally spend the rest of eternity in the air if you wanted to. Not that I recommend that, of course, she said, though I got the feeling that she said this absent-mindedly and was as lost in the scenery as I was. I shook myself away from looking at the city of flowers and smiled at Jo. Well, thanks for the information. So, what about growing and shrinking? How do we do that? I changed the topic. Jo motioned for us to fly up higher, and I followed her as we went high above the city until we were up by the branches of the swamp trees. All right, that should be high enough. Don't want to grow and end up stepping on someone's flower. That's a good way to lose a foot. Jo fiddled with her sleeves as she spoke, unbuttoning and rolling them up. Wait, what do you mean lose a foot? I asked in surprise. Jo gestured down to the flowers. Well, each one of those has a force field surrounding it that burns anyone other than the Ellylldan that it belongs to. That's one way to keep unwanted guests from coming over, I joked, and for the first time, Jo cracked a smile. Unfortunately, her smile didn't last long, and she soon changed the subject. Anyway, to grow and shrink is a little more complicated. You have to will it, say, grow, and then close your eyes. Jo demonstrated and closed her eyes. As soon as she did this, she grew much, much larger. And though she was likely the size of a normal person, to me she was colossal. Not wanting to remain at risk of being squashed by Jo simply moving her hand a little too fast, I shouted, "Grow!" Unlike Jo instructed, though, I forgot to close my eyes. This didn't seem to affect anything, as it worked perfectly. But as I and everything on me grew, the world spun around me, and my stomach lurched. Jo crossed her arms and shook her head. Yeah, that feeling of wanting to lose your guts? Next time, close your eyes and that won't happen. Covering my mouth, I resisted the urge to retch, and Jo patted me on the back gently. Do your best not to vomit, by the way. We don't eat, so all that's going to come up is little bits of mucus and saliva. It'll just be a lot of painful heaving. Describing that does not make it easier to not do it, I groaned. Jo gave me one last pat on the back, and though her lips didn't show it, I felt that she was doing her best to contain a grin. Eventually I stood up straight again as my stomach settled, and Jo took this as her chance to continue explaining. To shrink back, you do the same thing, but you just say shrink instead, she said, and once her eyes were closed, immediately did so. I quickly followed suit and made sure to close my eyes this time. It took me a moment to realize when the shrinking had finished, but I was happy to find that I didn't feel sick at all this time around. Back to our normal size, we floated back down to the ground, and Jo rifled through her satchel, pulling out a hammer, some nails, and 2 planks of wood, one considerably wider than the other. I looked at her in shock, as her satchel had been far too small to have fit everything she pulled out of it. It took her a few moments to realize, but once she did, she gave me an equally quizzical look in return. What, you've never seen a portal bag before? She asked, a couple nails clutched between her teeth as she opened the mouth of the bag to show me the portal swirling inside of it. I was about to answer, but she cut me off as she set her things down on the ground to ramble at me. Well, if you're to be believed, you've technically never seen anything before. How does that even work? You say you don't know, but I don't think I believe you. I've met thousands of other Ellylldan, and none of them are as messed up as you are. How is that? I stared blankly at her for a moment, unsure of how to answer, when I heard Theia's voice echo through my mind. Do not tell her about me, Autumn. I don't want anyone inconsequential to know about our situation. After an uncomfortably long pause, I cleared my throat. I told you before. I don't know. With a hand over her mouth, she nodded slowly. Then, narrowing her eyes, she turned around, knelt on the ground, and began digging a small hole. "You're a bad liar, you know," she called over her shoulder as, her hole now dug, she hammered one of the planks into it. "But if you want to play the crazy narrative, go ahead." I knelt next to her on the ground. "I'm not lying," I insisted, but all I got in reply was a mm-hmm. So I decided to change the subject instead. "What are you doing, by the way?" I asked, poking her lightly on the shoulder. Pausing in her hammering one plank to the other, she shot me a side glance. "I'm making your sign," she answered. This only raised more questions, though, so I raised an eyebrow at her. "Your sign? For your flower? Because all of these flowers look exactly the same? We'd be forever lost if we didn't use signs to keep track," she explained, unamused by my questioning. "What if someone rearranges the signs?" I asked, mischievous plans admittedly creeping into my mind. "Nuh-uh, no, don't even think about it. Some girl did that a couple years ago, and so many people lost hands and fingers that day. One guy even got killed. Actually, in total, we all killed her about 100 times, so we got our revenge," Joe said, and I looked at her curiously. "Oh, right. Since we reappear in our flowers after we die almost instantly, death isn't a big thing for us. I mean, it still hurts, but overall it's a minor inconvenience," she explained nonchalantly. The conversation lulled as Joe got back to work on the sign, and as she finished hammering the last nail, she stood up and stepped back a bit. I did the same, but was confused as the sign was blank. I was about to ask Joe about this, but fell silent as I noticed her tracing runes out in the air. She finished performing the spell, and slowly in the wood of the sign, the name Autumn was burned. I smiled and gave Joe a quick hug. She lifted her arms up awkwardly in response, but didn't try to push me away until a few seconds had passed. "Anyway, my flower is 3 to the right of yours, so if you need anything, just let me know." She stepped away from me nervously and waved before quickly walking away. Alone again, I walked up to my flower, unsure of how to get back inside of it. I paced around it for a moment until I remembered that I had originally gotten out of it by touching it. So I reached up and gently brushed my fingers against the smooth exterior of a petal. Thankfully, my guess was correct, and one petal next to the one I had touched unfolded itself from the rest, allowing me to enter.